So this is where we left off on Wednesday. We're going to finish up the chapter 1 material. Are there any questions right off the bat that we need to address about the class, about the material from Monday or Wednesday? Anything? Okay. So I think where we ended is we were talking about the chemical composition of nutrients and kind of the difference between inorganic nutrients like metals that are really important. So components like iron that are in red blood cells that give those red blood cells the ability to carry oxygen. Organic substances have carbon in them or contain carbon in them. These are macronutrients. A lot of energy production is just moving carbons around, shifting carbons into different molecules and getting them into a form where we can make a molecule called ATP, which we use for muscle contraction. All right? So, how do we capture or measure energy? And that's in calories. So we've all heard this term calories. We know that food provides calories. We know that we burn a certain amount of calories when we do certain exercises. We know that certain foods have more or less calories in them, et cetera, et cetera. So we really want to make sure that we're on the same page when it comes to calories. So calories is a unit of heat. It's a measure of heat. Okay? And so the way that the amount of calories in a certain type of food or in a certain substance is measured is quite literally by burning it and seeing how much heat it gives off. So if you wanted to see like how many calories were in some sort of food, you could take that food and put it into an instrument called a bomb calorimeter and then basically burn it up and measure the amount of heat it gives off. Now, the amount of heat that is required to raise 1 cubic centimeter of water 1 degree Celsius, that's the definition of a calorie. Okay? So basically what you need to remember is that it's a unit of heat and that it's a measure of heat. And so if we, for example, wanted to measure the number of calories that somebody burned in a given day, the most ideal scenario would be to put them in a room called a direct calorimeter. And basically they would sit in that room for 24 hours and we would directly measure the amount of heat that person gave off over that 24-hour period, and then you would know how many calories they burned in a 24-hour period, right? This is really cumbersome, it's really expensive, it's not easy to obtain. There's only a few of those types of machines around the country. So we have other ways of estimating this. Okay, so through careful studies across a large swaths of the population, we know we can basically come up with estimated energy equations. And these are the types of things that you can go to on the web and just type in like basal metabolic rate equation or estimated energy needs, daily energy needs, or those types of things. You put in things that we know influence metabolic rate, like age, gender, height, okay, activity level, body fat percentage. And the more of those kind of variables that you know and have an understanding of accurately, then the more accurately these equations can predict how many calories that you burn in a day, right? Now, it's really important to understand that anytime you do something like this, so if you read an equation or you put your information into an equation and it just gives you and you calculate it, that is an estimate. The amount of calories that we burn in a day, it's very important to appreciate the fact that the amount of calories that we burn in the day is dependent on a lot of different factors, including your genetics, your activity level, the food that you eat, the amount of sleep that you got, the external environment. All these different things can affect it. Okay? So it's a starting place. Okay? All right. So calories are not a substance that are present in food. You don't eat a food and the calories are in there. It's the nutrients in the nutrients in the food that, when burned, can be captured, that energy release can be captured in calories. Does that subtlety make sense? So it's that subtle difference makes sense. So it's important to understand that it's a unit of measure for the amount of energy that's in food. Calorie is not a nutrient. Okay. So the other thing, so we can measure the amount of calories that are in food, and we can also measure the amount of calories that we produce for either just being alive, which would be what's called our resting metabolic rate, or a basal metabolic rate. This is the amount of energy that's required just to keep our heart beating, our lungs functioning, our liver functioning, our kidneys functioning. That requires energy, right? That's the vast majority of the energy that we burn during the day. Now, then if you want to have the daily metabolic rate, that's the total number of calories that you burn throughout the day, including the calories you burn walking to class, going for a workout, doing some kind of workout, recovering from that workout, fidgeting. So what's your name? Justin. So Justin's sitting up here in the front row trying to stay awake, and he's fidgeting and his leg is moving. This is called non-exercise activity thermogenesis. He is subconsciously burning calories through fidgeting. And this is actually a whole field of study, and they've demonstrated, they've put people into those kind of calorimetry rooms like that I talked about just a few minutes ago, where they measure heat production, and they will overfeed them purposefully, 400 calories or 500 calories over what they need metabolically. And people that have a tendency to regulate their weight carefully, or they don't seem to put on weight very easily, they've covered that room in a grid of lasers, and those individuals will fidget off almost exactly what they were overfed, right? Versus individuals that are a little bit more prone to weight gain don't have those compensatory mechanisms. So there's a lot going on when it comes to calories and calorie balance and metabolism and metabolic rate and the things that go into the amount of calories that we consume and the amount of calories that we burn in a day. And we don't want to be too simplistic about this, just saying, well, the calories I bring in need to be balanced by the calories I burn. And yes, in essence, that is true. But there's a lot of physiologic adjustments that occur that cause changes within those things. Some of them are subconscious, some of them are conscious. Questions on this? Comments? I see some kind of straining faces to understand things. So ask me what you're misunderstanding or what I'm not getting clear. No? Yes? Oh, you're saying it's good. Okay. Thanks, buddy. Okay. So energy yielding nutrients are what we call macronutrients. And this is where things we haven't done a good job making things very clear. So carbohydrates provide 4 calories per gram. Lipids provide 9 calories per gram. Proteins provide 4 calories per gram. So I've already alluded to this, right? In the last class, I think I said that there were 2.5 times the amount of calories for the same amount of food in fat than in carbohydrates and protein. Now, we don't use protein very well as a fuel. We'll get into the details of that in a couple weeks. But mainly what we use as fuel, it comes from fat and carbohydrates, and you get 2.5 times more the amount of energy. Now, this means that if you took a square of fat that weighed 1 gram and you put it into a bomb calorimeter, it would give off 9 calories of heat. If you took the exact same amount of carbohydrate, the exact mass, weight, same size square, put it into a bomb calorimeter, burned it, it would give off 4 calories of heat. Does this make sense? Okay. And the reason why that's important is because that refers to density. Something that releases more energy but is the exact same size and weight is more energy dense. So when we talk about energy dense foods, a lot of times we're referring to foods that have a lot of energy, which are oftentimes high in fat for a given amount of that food. Okay? Remember we talked about nutrient density versus energy density? Okay, so this is where that comes together. Now, where it gets kind of, it's not, it can be a little bit, not confusing, but just there's subtleties, is that not all carbohydrates contain energy that's accessible by humans. So fiber is a carbohydrate, but we do not absorb fiber into our bloodstream and use it as energy. But it's still technically a carbohydrate, but we don't get any energy out of it. Do you understand? Okay. Or is that clear? So when you eat lettuce, for example, lettuce has 0 calories, but it's a carbohydrate. It's just that all the carbohydrate is fiber, and we can't access that. In contrast, when you eat pasta, we can access, that's starch. Starch is a different type of carbohydrate that we can break down and absorb those sugars or those carbohydrates into the system and use them as energy. Okay? Questions on that? Okay, cool. So, this is, again, we're just kind of getting on the same page with a lot of the terminology that we are going to use throughout the term. So I want to be able to say things like energy yielding carbohydrate, or this is a type of carbohydrate that has 4 calories per gram, or this fat, and this food is energy dense because it contains a lot of fat, and that if you overeat or you undereat, you're going to be at a caloric imbalance. Okay, so this is just setting up a lot of the things that we're going to talk about as the term goes on. So it's important that we get on the same page with it. Now, what happens when a person gets too little or not enough of a nutrient or energy? And again, we're going to talk more about the specifics. So like if you're deficient, say, specifically in vitamin C, then you're at risk for developing a disease called scurvy. I don't even know if you've ever heard of scurvy because it's basically non-existent in the developed world because we all get plenty of vitamin C to prevent scurvy. Right? But that's one of the things that can happen when you have malnutrition or an under. There's other issues. If you're under-consuming in energy, there's issues in terms of how you can, there's issues with that. There's both health issues, there's performance issues, there's a bunch of different things that we can consider. So malnutrition is a condition that is characterized by an excess or deficiency in energy or nutrient. So malnutrition just means like something's not optimized or something's not there. It does, a lot of times we think of malnutrition or malnourished individual as being undernourished. But an individual that's gaining weight rapidly due to a high energy dense diet is maybe not healthy and they're gaining weight and gaining body fat. You could also argue that they are overnourished, or that is a form of malnourishment. Okay? So a person can be both over and undernourished, and you may be scratching your head and saying, well, how can this be? Well, think about someone that if somebody eats McDonald's every day, they are overnourished in calories and undernourished in critical vitamins and minerals and nutrients. Right? So when we talk about a balanced diet, what we're talking about is a diet that's based on whole, unprocessed, healthy foods that provide the calories that we need to support our energy demands throughout the day so that we can function in terms of doing our workout, walking from class, staying awake in class, being alert, meeting the energy demands that we need to upkeep our liver and our heart and our organs and our functions and our skeletal muscle and recover from our workouts. We're also talking about getting enough nutrients and vitamins and minerals to support all those processes that require energy. So these vitamins and minerals and nutrients and those types of things, they support the processes that use energy that help us create this healthy situation or optimized situation. Right. So under nutrition, there's a couple examples in your book. They just put the figures up here. This is obviously, there's a couple different types. The point they're trying to make here with these illustrations is that there's overt undernutrition where people, unfortunately sometimes very young people, are starving. There's other less overt situations where a child in a developing country that is getting, say, enough protein and macronutrients, but maybe not getting enough iron or some other thing, and it's creating health issues, but they're not so clearly just seen with the naked eye. Does that make sense? Now, overnutrition is a form of malnourishment, and is characterized by excess body weight. That's what they're trying to illustrate here. This is a concern. This is a concern in terms of a public health concern, so it's a concern from a societal standpoint. You can look at the epidemiologic data. So this type of picture is what is called anecdotal. It's one example of two young individuals that are overweight, and they're trying to say, the point they're trying to make is that this is all too common. But that's backed up by the epidemiologic data, which shows obesity rates in young people and older people are rising, and it's becoming epidemic, is what they call it, the obesity epidemic, because of it's affecting, we're talking about 25 to 50% of the country. So it's becoming almost normal. All right, now, in regards to how we utilize nutrients, one of the things that we'll talk about, so we're going to kind of break things down and talk about things in the context of, carbohydrates, and we'll do a deep dive into those, and then lipids, and we're going to do a deep dive into the physiology of how we absorb nutrients and those types of things. And these are those are the topics, but we need to understand the context of what's going on when we're eating. Because this type of thing, and your book does a really good job, the fact that we're even talking about diet-gene interaction is not something that is commonly taught at the general nutrition level, I would say. And the point here is that each person, not in a warm, fuzzy, kumbaya sort of way, every single individual is just that, an individual. You have a unique set of genes that have been combined with whatever unique environment that you developed in the womb in, that you grew up with, that you've been exposed to. And when your diet, which is part of your environment, and those genes interact, it leads to the outward expression of characteristics, which is called a phenotype. So there's genotype, which are the genes, and then there's phenotype, which is the outward characteristic that's expressed. And it doesn't have to be things like blue eyes or brown eyes. That is a type of phenotype. But it can be the expression of things like high blood pressure or heart disease, or those sorts of things are also certain phenotypes. And we know that there are genetic, without getting too far into it, that there are variations within individuals' genomes that affect their risk for certain types of diseases. Right? So have you all seen advertisements for things like 23andMe, for example? So 23andMe is a genetic testing company whereby you pay a couple $100 and you send away for this kit. They send you the kit, you spit in a tube, send it back, you send your spit back to them. They take sloughed off cheek cells from that spit and they analyze it, and they can tell you based on the genes that are in the DNA in your cheek cells, if you have certain what are called polymorphisms, and those polymorphisms are related to things like heart disease, high blood pressure, but they can also tell us things like this type of polymorphism makes this individual more susceptible to Achilles injuries or ACL injuries, or this person is more likely to respond to a diet that is low in dairy and high in fruit and vegetables or something like that, right? Or these individuals have gene polymorphisms that are more likely that they'll be high responders to weight training versus exercise or versus endurance training. So there's different insights that we can get from their genetics, from an individual's genetics. But you don't necessarily need that type of test to know your body. You just have to get in touch with your body and know that, okay, I'm eating this, and I need to be aware of adverse reactions, right? And so just a quick aside, at the 400 level, the senior level, I teach a exercise physiology class that talks about the molecular mechanisms and gene interactions of exercise and diet. And as part of that class, we typically have one person that volunteers, or we draw straws or pick a number, that sort of thing, and they get to do this genetic testing. And they get tested for about 70 genes that are associated with exercise performance and diet in some sort of way. And then the class as a project takes that and analyzes it for that individual. And a couple years ago we did one, and it came back, and the individual had the gene for lactose intolerance. And it was like, well, what really information does this give us? Do we really need a gene to tell you when you're lactose intolerant? Because if you're lactose intolerant, it's usually pretty clear. You eat cheese or drink milk and you have really bad gas, diarrhea, and a bad stomach ache. Like, you don't need a genetic test to tell you that. She had no idea. She was like, so that's why cheese, it was, anyways. So she was like really lactose intolerant and had no idea. So I guess in that case you do need it. My point is, you really need to kind of be in touch with, and that's a big part of this class, is giving you awareness so that you can understand why when you eat certain things or do other things, you feel certain ways, right? So diet and gene interaction. The other thing about this is you'll hear oftentimes out in the media or in other places where they just say, look, it's a simple equation. You eat less than you burn, and we can map that out with a math equation, and if we do that, you should lose this amount of weight on this type of schedule. And it doesn't work like that. We are complex physiologic systems, and everybody is going to respond differently. Okay? So there's data that demonstrate that you can look at across several hundred female participants in a study that all are prescribed to exercise at the recommended exercise dose. Every single one of them responds slightly different in terms of their cardiovascular response. Some actually get worse, while others have a huge response and others don't change at all. And we all know this phenomenon because if anyone's ever tried to start a workout program, or they've been on some sort of team with other people, everybody's doing the same thing, and people are responding completely differently, right? So if you and a friend decide to go, we're going to do this workout program every day, and we're going to do the exact same thing, and we're also going to eat the same, and all of a sudden 2 weeks down the road, you've gained 3 pounds and you're exhausted, and they've lost 8 pounds and they're like getting ripped, right? But you're doing the exact same thing in the exact same way. That's because there's responders and non-responders to different types of diets and different types of exercises and different types of approaches. And it's really important to embrace that individuality and that understanding of individuality, to know that you may respond differently when you're put in a certain situation. So we don't just boil it down. And this happens a lot, because you'll end up saying, well, I do this or I do that, and people get really frustrated, and they're never told, well, maybe you're not a responder to this type of diet or this type of workout. A lot of times we just assume they must not be doing it right. So we want to be careful about that. So genes can affect your risk for different types of diseases. They can affect your responsiveness to different types of exercise programs. They can affect your... So genetics plays a big part of this. And it's something that we oftentimes want to sort of just ignore and think that everything is just in our control and all we have to do is, you know, grind every day, bro. And then you'll get what you want. So you just have to think about that. I'm being facetious. Couple other things in regards to this. So not only do the genes that exist within you and the polymorphisms that exist within your genome, not only can those affect your responsiveness to different types of diet and exercise programs, but there's another level called, let's see here. How much do we want to say on this? Okay. There's another level called nutrigenomics. And nutrigenomics is this study of how different nutrients affect the expression of different genes. And this is really kind of at the tip of the sword in terms of its development. And I think it's useful that we're talking about it so that it's on your radar. But these are the types of things that are going to eventually lead to personalized and individualized nutrition. So basically what we can do with genomics or nutrigenetics is we can feed you some sort of type of meal, any one of you, and literally look at what genes get turned on and what genes don't get turned on in response to a different meal or in response to a different exercise program. All right. And this used to be a very tedious process to look at gene expression. But we now have this new technology called omics technology where you can take a piece of tissue or you can take a drop of urine or you can take a drop of blood and you put it on a microchip and it can tell you the expression of 10 to 15,000 genes like that. Right? So it's expensive and it's not necessarily commercialized yet. But that's the way genetic testing from, spitting in the tube and sending it off. It used to be too expensive to do commercially. Now it's not. It's fairly affordable for people with that type of means. Okay? Now, there's one more aspect or one more layer to this, which is called epigenetics. You should write that down because I'm not sure it's in the notes. And what epigenetics is epigenetics are actually how nutrition and exercise alters the structure of the DNA. So you have your DNA and you have your environment, but there's another layer of regulation in between there, which is how your DNA is packaged, which affects how your environment can affect the DNA. Does this make sense? So we have genetics, then we have epigenetic regulation, then we have environmental regulation. Okay? And some of the epigenetic regulation, this is a really interesting field. Epigenetics came about when some of the first studies in epigenetics came about when they started studying Scandinavian countries, which have a fairly homogeneous gene pool. There's not a lot of diversity in Finland, for example. So they have a pretty set standard gene pool. And what they found is that if an individual was born either during times of famine or during times when there was high food availability, they had a completely different risk for obesity despite having very similar genetic codes. Right? This is the idea behind epigenetics, is that there are changes in the environment that can alter how DNA is accessed, which can alter how our genes interact with the environment. Okay? And some of this takes place in the womb, which I can't do much about what my mother ate while I was in the womb. Right? But it is important to understand that the food that you eat, for example, when you're pregnant, can have an impact on an individual's risk for diabetes later in life because of these epigenetic changes. Okay? So these are kind of the layers that we're going to discuss this topic of nutrition and choosing healthy diets about. And we want to be able to say, well, this type of diet showed this type of response at an epigenetic level or at a genetic level, or in this type of person with this type of genome, in this type of environment, has this type of phenotype. We want to be able to have those discussions. And yes, it's complex, but each person is an individual. And you all get the opportunity to kind of use this information in the class to better understand who you are as an individual in your relationship with this thing, food, that we all have to have. Okay. Questions on that? Anything that I can add to that to make it more clear? I don't know why this thing is here. I don't want to add a comment. I just want to move on. Okay, so examples of healthy diet. We'll talk about this a lot more, but variety, balance, and moderation are the keys. Those of you that have started reading In Defense of Food, it's basically a different way of saying, what does he say? Eat mostly plants, not too much. Eat whole foods, not too much, and mostly plants, or something like that. He kind of has a summarization, which is basically this: eat real food, get a lot of variety, balance the types of food that you're getting, and consume calorie-dense foods in moderation. Now, one of the things that we'll talk about is, which I don't always think it's great to lump fruits and vegetables together, because people don't really appreciate how many calories are in fruits and how much of those calories are sugar or carbohydrates. And when we learn about carbohydrates and we talk about insulin and we talk about insulin responses and those types of things, we'll talk about the benefits, the pros and cons of, say, reaching for like a banana or an apple, thinking that that's a healthy snack. It does have a lot of vitamins and minerals, and these are very good for you, but it's better to consume those with meals so that you're not randomly spiking insulin throughout the day. We'll talk about what those types of things mean. So we'll talk about how to utilize variety, balance, moderation, those types of things. The different foods within different food groups and different colors of food. So we talked about having a colorful plate. Did anybody think of that when they ate after Wednesday? Like, did they look and see a lot of brown and gray usually, right? Not a lot of color. Maybe some pepperoni. Maybe you get some red of pepperoni, but okay. So balance, their idea of balance, the book's idea of balance is kind of interesting. Anyways, so the balance is we are complex biological systems, and we have to appreciate that food is more than just nutrients, and that we're not robots, and we don't just want to eat plain salads all the time, or plain cooked chicken with salad all the time, right? So we have to appreciate the fact that there are times when there's particular, whether it's social situations or cultural situations or these types of things, where we need to eat food that may not be considered quote unquote healthy, but it's the right thing to do at that time, and you're doing it for the right reasons, right? And as long as you're conscious of it, and as long as you're aware of it, then that's completely within your own realm of decision making. Where it gets complicated is like with the examples of Doritos, when they've used like sophisticated chemicals and sophisticated advertising so that people unsuspectingly consume more than they would otherwise, because they're basically being deceived. That's passive consumption, right? So what we're talking about when we talk about balance, and you know, it just is like, there's no subtlety in this. Balance unhealthy choices with healthy choices. Like, what does that even mean? What does that look like on paper, right? Or what does that look like in action? I guess we know what it looks like on paper. So you do need to think about like how much you should be eating based on how active that you're being, what your overall goals are, why you're consuming something. Is it because you're bored? Is it because you think it tastes good? Is it because you're happy? Is it because you're sad? Is it because you're in a certain social situation? Is it because all these different things just raise our awareness? And that's all. I'm not here to say this is good, this is bad, this is better, this is worse. I'm simply a provider of information so that you all can become more aware of why you're eating certain things at certain times. And we've never had to deal with this sort of thing. So we don't have great innate systems that evolution gave us because we've always just been opportunistic. We've had to eat what we could grow or hunt or get our hands on to survive. But now we just have every type of food all the time, and we're reminded of it all the time through advertisements, and they even place foods at different levels on shelves and in different places in gas stations and grocery stores to make you think that you want stuff that you would have never thought of wanting before. And they build these complex models of gas stations and grocery stores, and then they do studies on people that come in. Where do they go to? Where do their eyes go to? What kind of color draws their eyes to it? What types of claims and things like that on the front of packages can they get? What types of associations can they make? I have a good friend of mine who is now at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and he studies functional brain imaging and how our blood flow in our brain changes when different things are going on with food. So for example, he published a paper and has given a couple talks on how people that drink Coke have a completely different blood flow to their desire centers of their brain when they see a Coke advertisement compared to someone that's never tasted Coke before. And Coke knows these sorts of things, so they put advertisements in places to trigger that blood flow so that people go like, yeah, I am kind of thirsty. I'm going to get this Coke. Right? So there's a lot going on here. So just telling someone balance unhealthy choices with healthy choices, it's harder than just saying that. Right? But it doesn't mean that it's not obtainable, if you will. You just need to become aware of what's going on. Okay, so they use a couple examples basically saying if you can drink a coffee from Starbucks with no whipped cream, then this is basically, that little bit of whipped cream there is equivalent to a 30-minute run. All right? So the difference between a Big Mac and a small cheeseburger is 1 hour of, these guys are really happy to be playing golf. They good God, they got a special invitation to Augusta or something. But anyways, so it would take an hour of walking a golf course and playing golf to get the difference between these two things. And this is something that I think is a really important point to kind of stop and just make, which is that we often underestimate the amount of calories that things like jogging and running and those types of things burn. So a lot of people will go and walk for 25, 30 minutes or go on a hike and then feel like they earned ice cream or a Big Mac or something like that, right? And there's a disconnect between how much we actually burn and what is in what we actually eat. All right? So it's important to, again, this is about raising awareness and becoming more in touch with this. And this will make more sense as we get into specific nutrients and specific foods that contain those nutrients and those types of things. Again, we're just laying a groundwork here. Okay, moderation is really important. We know that it's not just important in terms of balancing calories, but that there's mind tricks, whatever. There's things in our mind that are different when we practice moderation. So for example, people that eat the same amount of calories but eat it on a big plate versus on a small plate exact same amount of calories, they will report feeling less full when they eat it on the big plate. Okay? So if you eat with bigger utensils, you will subconsciously eat more and not get full as fast or feel as satisfied after that meal if you eat with large utensils. And when you look at the size of utensils, in the average size of utensils in restaurants over the last 25 years, they've increased significantly because they know this information. They can get people to eat more and come back more often if they feed them things on larger plates. This is one of my favorite studies of all time is a study called the Endless Bowl of Soup study. And this guy, he basically created this situation where people came in and he said, eat this bowl of soup. You have a half an hour to eat as much as you can, or you can stop when you're full, or you can finish the bowl, right? So people come in, it's just a little bowl of soup. They eat it, they finish it easily within a half an hour, and then they give perceptions of, I feel this full, I feel this satisfied, I feel like it's going to be this long before I go back and need to initiate feeding again or eat again. So then they have them come in a second time and they said, exact same thing. We just want you to do the same thing. But in this condition, he invented this bowl that imperceptibly bubbles soup up from the bottom in a way that they have no idea. So they can make a dent in it and it goes down a little bit, but you can't finish it. It's an endless bowl of soup. And so they eat it over that half an hour. And at the end of that, they ask them, so there's still soup in the bowl at the end of it. When they measure the amount of calories, they eat anywhere from 1/3 to twice as much more. So 30 to 50% more soup. But they report being less full because there's still soup in the bowl, right? So when we say things like all things in moderation, there's real consequences to that, and it's things like little things like not eating chips out of a bag, but putting them in a bowl and stopping when the bowl is done, as opposed to stopping when the bag is done. Right? This is the one I'm guilty with because I love salt and vinegar chips. Okay, that's fine. So we'll go through these last few slides on Monday, and we'll start chapter 2. The week 2 module should unlock, and I'll see you guys on Monday.